So, an Ivy League professor recently made headlines for forcing all of her college students to use 1950s manual typewriters in class. Now, you might think you know my reaction to this, but you might want to stick around to hear more. I'm Christopher Lind, and this is Future Focus. And this week, we're going to take a closer look at what this college professor was doing when they banned screens and went to manual typewriters, and why this isn't the regression to the Stone Age you might think. To your surprise, I actually, after digging into this, think this is a masterclass in strategic leadership we should all pay close attention to and consider in our own worlds. But before we get started, if you find value in the content I create, would you do me a favor and would you like and follow if you don't? And if you know somebody who would benefit from this, or even just be curious to hear this story, please share it with them. And if you get some value out of it, head over to buymeacoffee.com/Christopher Lind and you can say thanks. Or if you or your organization would benefit from the expertise or perspective that I bring to conversations like this, check out my website and see if there's a way I can help you out. Okay. So let's get into this, because I actually, if I'm being honest, had a reaction and dramatically changed over the course of actually digging into this. So here's the context. Back in spring of 2023, this college language professor, German professor, Grit Matthias Phelps, once a semester, so here's the key detail. There is an assignment, okay? There's an assignment that she has all of her students do that is strictly analog. No screens, no spell check, no AI, nothing. And as a parent, I also thought this was hilarious the way she incorporated this as a full-blown experience. She incorporates her 7 and 9-year-old kids to act as anti-tech support, to kind of like help police things and offer support along the way. So this is a complete re-engineering of things. This is not a, we're going back to the Stone Age type of a thing. But that's actually what, as I dug into it, I realized I had a reaction to the headline because of some of the things I interact with in higher ed, where I've had interactions with professors and institutions where they're doing an overreact. And they're saying, like, we're going to do this. I had one professor specifically, I remember, where I got into it a bit because he was forcing all of his students to do everything with pen and paper just for the sake of it. And he wouldn't accept anything if it wasn't handwritten on a piece of paper. And it was just so frustrating so then I heard this and I went, oh, here we go again. But this was not that. This was a very strategic, architected, engineered thing within the broader context of it. And granted, there's some details I don't have all the details of, but I actually want to talk about why this is brilliant and how to do something similar like this, because I think this is something we all should be considering right now. Now, couple things that I want to set up before we get into the how to actually pull something like this off. Because like I said, my initial reaction to this was, as we move into the further digital age and AI continues to expand, we do run the risk of erring on incorporating pointless friction into our systems as an overreaction to tech. And I understand where it comes from, but it's really, really unhelpful. So like I said, I had this professor who was frustrated with kids turning in, or students, whatever, turning in AI slop. And so rather than deal with it, he just moved to say, you need to handwrite everything. Honestly, when part of the reason we had such a riff in this is he was convinced this was working. But when I dug under the surface, I went, this isn't actually solving any of your problems. All you're doing is actually making all your students not want to be in your class anymore. They're going to other you're creating friction for the sake of friction. There is no you were not, and this was not a handwriting class, by the way. Okay. So actually having people practice writing out, you can't even say the skill was relevant to the class, but this is something that happens very frequently. We saw this post-pandemic, where all of a sudden companies were forcing people back into the office just so that they could sit on Zoom calls in the name of collaboration and innovation, making things difficult for people for no reason other than, well, we used to do it that way, and I think it somehow was better back then, so we're going to go back to this. When we actually have access to better solutions, better tools to be able to do this. we think we're protecting our team skills by going back to some healthy, unrealistic version of nostalgia, when actually some of these things that I've seen, these anti-tech movements, actually make people more digitally illiterate. It's actually harming them over the long term. And I see this in corporate settings too, where, we're going to block all our AI usage here because we don't want things to happen. Well, either one, people go around it because that's just what they're going to do, and they find creative ways, which actually makes you more vulnerable to people using non-protected tools, putting your company IP in non-protected systems, right? It opens all this other stuff. Or on the other side, you end up having workforce or employees that go, okay, well, I'll abide by this pointless friction that you've injected into the system. And now they're not getting the benefit from the tools, and they're also not preparing themselves for this new digital world. So you're double punishing yourself by having an overreaction to tech adoption and incorporating pointless friction. And I see this all the time. And in the end, you're not only making the organization vulnerable and yourself vulnerable to your competitors, but you're actually harming the people around you. And so the stubbornness and this attachment to nostalgia, it's not a strategy. It's a liability. And so when I first saw this article, I thought that's what this was. But as I dug into it, I went, no, this is actually not that. Now, here's the other thing, though, because I just painted a picture of what the anti-tech movement can be. Now, for any of you who listen to me for any extended period of time, I'm also not a supporter of the opposite. So while I talk a lot about AI, I'm a big fan of using AI. I think people need to build AI literacy and know how to use AI well. I am not an advocate or supporter of blind AI use. So the reckless pursuit of AI for the sake of AI, I would advocate that is equally, if not possibly more dangerous. I don't even know that the comparison's there. But it's, let's just say, equally dangerous as this blind nostalgic resistance. Because when you just start going down the blind AI use and you assume we can throw AI at any problem and it'll go, well, yeah, that's like, incorporating digital tools with no delete keys, because you go, it's faster. If people don't ever, undo what they did, we got rid of undo and we got rid of delete because we heard it was the best and we just trust agents to fill the gaps. Well, hold on. Like, there's a reason why we incorporate strategic friction into things, because that seamless, frictionless output that just comes off gut emotions or whatever sounds good in the moment, well, that doesn't go well either. When we encourage people to just run without thinking before they act, that is equally dangerous. Now you stack AI on top of it, you're just accelerating things to levels that there are, not even there. So if the professor went the other way, I would have had the same reaction. If they just went, well, we just encourage everybody to have AI do their homework for them, I'd be like, well, that's not helping either. Okay, so I don't want anybody to listen to this and think I'm saying nostalgia bad, AI use good. No, actually, nostalgia, overreaction to tech bad, over adoption of AI use equally bad. And so I think it's these two extremes that we tend to find society right now gravitating towards one of the two instead of what this exercise really was. And I think this is where I want to spend the majority of my time. This will still be probably a briefer episode, but I want to break down the anatomy of this, because this is the part that we really need to focus on, because I think this is where the brilliance of this is that we all can do. So if you look at step one and you dig into this situation, the professor identified some real problems. She started with the problem. The problem was students were not just using AI, but she saw how they weren't collaborating with each other. They weren't thinking critically. They weren't translating what they were presenting as information that they'd acquired, things they'd learned and now were presenting on. They didn't even actually have any sort of cohesive memory or ability to translate it to anything. Those are real legitimate skill problems. Okay. That was a real thing that she recognized was a problem. And if you were to sit and think about these things, we tend to jump to solutions. But if you were to think about this, you could deconstruct some of the problems that you may be experiencing around AI right now. But you would need to do that first and actually do that. And that's exactly what this individual did. And they tied it to skills as that second step. It wasn't just, well, they're turning in AI slop. And that's what I see a lot. People are like, oh, I'm fed up with AI. I'm fed up with AI content. I'm fed up with this. And you're like, but why? What about it is actually bothering you? And most people don't take the time to do that. And that's what this professor did well, actually broke this down into the core skills of here's what we're trying to develop in this class. Here's the desired outcome of the class. And the same is true with you in a work setting or even a personal setting. You should, and if you don't, you should take the time to figure this out. What is the desired outcome that you're trying to get to? What is this problem, but how is it actually preventing you from achieving the thing that you initially set out to do? And in this case, like I said, this professor identified, well, they're not collaborating, they're not doing these things. Then, and this is where I think they did such a great job with it, and this is the third opportunity, is to say, okay, so how do we fix this? What do we actually do? And again, instead of just saying we're done with devices, no AI use, everything pen and paper from here on out, I'm going to make you go through a scanner before you come in to make sure you don't do any of this. We're not going to put notes on like you could do that. And that's what a lot of people do when they overreact. But instead, this professor literally took the time too. And I think this is one of the other things. We want things fixed, but we don't want to take the time to do it. This professor put in the work. She went out to all these thrift stores and found enough typewriters. You want to talk about effort? She committed to this, went out, shopped around, found a bunch of manual typewriters so that she would have enough for the entire class. That's someone who's committed to it, but didn't just say, all right, everybody, guess what? I found all these typewriters. I put in this work, so guess what? None of you can use computers anymore. No, this was all for a specific surgical exercise. That's commitment. That's a leader who cares deeply about the problem they're trying to solve and wants to solve it well while not causing undue harm in the long term. Because now this was a specific exercise. There were clear skills that were outlined. There was logic and reason behind why they were going to be doing what they had to do. And it was strategic friction built in. And I am sure, I'm not part of it, and I couldn't find all the details on this, but I'm sure there were students who thought this is the dumbest thing ever. Okay. I'm sure there were lots of people who had the initial reaction that I did when I saw it and went, you have got to be kidding me. There might have been people on the other end of it who went, thank goodness, finally we get to actually learn how to do something and actually write. And that, maybe initially would have been an overreaction in the other way, but this was a surgically designed strategic friction exercise that forced cognitive pause and actually had clear skills outlined of here's why we're doing this. We're doing this to build all these things. Now, the one thing that I didn't get a chance to find, I couldn't find anything on this, was how that was being measured. Because I still, if I'm being honest, have some skepticism on, did it actually accomplish the things that, you think it did? Now, on the surface, it seems brilliant, and I can see people walking away from it going, this is actually was really helpful. And again, even if it's not everything that you had hoped for, it was one assignment, which is why I think doing it surgically versus, okay, this class now is completely over to 1950s typewriters. We're going to resurrect the typewriter repair industry through this class. No, we're doing this for this one thing with these specific goals, and ideally build in some sort of debrief. But that's the key. This was done alongside. And I think that's something else that we have to think about. It's not this binary, do we do it nostalgia or do we do it the modern way? It's about saying, well, we need to modernize while also recognizing what is rich and true about the nostalgic piece, what really was core underneath that. And then how do we build that? And even in this case, go to the extreme of actually making us go back to it, but for a purpose, for a purpose and for a specific set of time for a specific objective so that we actually pull you out of. And there are times, there's, to give an example of this, a lot of times when it comes to, you'll hear the term learning in the flow of work. It's a term that gets thrown around all the time. And people assume that because I'm a digital person, I'm all about convenience and accessibility. They always banked on the fact that, well, Christopher's always going to advocate for learning in the flow of work. And I frequently would go, no, actually, in this instance, you need to pull learning out of the flow of work because you actually need to shake people loose from their environment. And people always would kind of go, that's not what I expected you to say. And it was like, well, because sometimes you do need to break the mundane, break the day-to-day so that you get people's attention. And I think that's exactly what this was to say, we're going extreme with this. Like, we're not just going to say, get out your pens and papers, because you know what? That's not going to shake you hard enough. We're going to take you out and you're going to use this 1950s typewriter. So now you're actually going to go, what is this thing? It's kind of familiar. It's a keyboard, but boy, I've got to almost like learn how to do this and actually go back to some of these fundamental skills that, are you really probably ever going to use them again? No, but that wasn't the purpose. The purpose was to create a bit of shock value, a bit of, jolting to take you back to something that actually shook people to where they needed to be so that they could move forward. And I actually think that's what's really, really brilliant about this. And so as you think about this moving forward, I actually would encourage every single one of you to think through something like this, to think through where might there be an opportunity to do something through this exact same stage. And as I spent some time thinking back over, my career where I've done these kinds of things, I think the process is the key because, I could outline a specific example and I could say, everybody go do that. But I don't think that would be terribly helpful to you because maybe that isn't actually the right environment or the right situation for you to focus on. But I think the guardrails that you can follow are, so just let's walk through this. Like, actually take the time as you're doing this, get a piece of paper, whatever, go grab a notebook or a typewriter if you happen to have one available, and think through this. What is a legitimate problem right now that you are experiencing that you believe and can quantitatively demonstrate is being negatively impacted by AI overuse? Take the time and how do you know? Not just you're feeling, not just you're frustrated, not just it's moving in a direction you want. How do you know it's actually having a negative impact on that? And think of examples that demonstrate that. It can't just be, well, my tummy tells me so. No, that's not evidence. You need to actually show where that is. And if you don't know where that is, well, then go find it. So first, make your analysis, your assumption, your hypothesis of what you think it is. Go get data to validate it. Then from there, actually break down, why is that actually a problem? Don't just prove it's a problem. Prove like in what way, and in a way that is actually tangible. Like what skills, what human capability, what organizational, situations are not working well as a direct result of this. Okay, you can figure that out. You can take the time to do that. Then from there, re-engineer something, come up with something. And this is an opportunity, if you do it strategically, where you're not saying everything is going to go to this. It's okay to be a little bit crazy with it. I thought the craziness of this actually was pretty brilliant given the circumstance. Go too far with it, the level of crazy has to adjust. But if you're saying, hey, we're just doing this for a specific thing, well, you can get a little crazy. You can go out and get some 1950s typewriters and go, well, hey, this is one exercise. But here's the thing, okay? And I'm going to add this specific piece to this because you have to factor in some of these things. Now, a good example, like with this typewriter thing, I'm not in this situation, but part of the brilliance behind it, I think, is you would have to factor that. And as an example, there are times I've engineered things for companies where I knew this was going to be disruptive, and I had to build that disruption into the implementation timeline. So when I think of this example, You got a bunch of, Gen Zers, Gen Alphas who have not ever even seen a typewriter coming in, and you slam this 1950s technology. Go watch a YouTube video of a Gen Zer trying to use an old school telephone, and you'll watch and you'll go, oh, okay, we need to account for that. As part of your surgical intervention, make sure you account for that. Maybe run a few tests to kind of go, what things might we not be, taking into consideration, and actually build that in. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself frustrated. Okay. And maybe there were a few rounds of this class where the first few times the professor was a little irritated because the first two sessions, all it was troubleshooting typewriter problems. Be careful, because if you go a little too crazy with your intervention, you may end up creating unintended problems. But by doing so, you can actually kind of shake people out of it. Just make sure that what you're designing as a surgical intervention is actually designed to do this. And I think that was the brilliance of this, was this idea that, okay, by removing the tech tools, by forcing manual things to do it, and by actually removing the delete key, the ability to delete things, we're actually forcing people to lay out their ideas, connect with their peers first. Like, what do you think? Get some feedback on this, lay out an outline, and actually then think through, how would I structure and communicate this? Because once I start putting it on paper, I can't just control, select all, delete when I'm done. I can't just revise it. Or if I do, I'm actually creating tremendous amounts of work. Now, you can see why you wouldn't want to do that on large scale, because otherwise you would add way too much friction. But for a surgical intervention, it's brilliant. And it's a way to actually say, can you show that that is improving those skills? Yeah, you can. She even brought her little student or her kids in to help police and participate in that. And that's the same kind of thing you can do in your office environment or your leadership team, to kind of say, all right, hey, is this actually doing it? Now, here's the thing. The one thing I will say on this is, especially if you're incorporating some of these kind of off the wall ideas, you have to be careful that you're being objective, that is it actually improving the problem you thought you were going to solve? Because the one risk not involved in it that I can see with this professor is getting so attached to the novelty of your idea. You fall in love with your idea, not realizing maybe it's not as surgical and as brilliant as it turns out. Maybe you end up wasting half the semester teaching your students how to use the typewriter, and you're way behind and they don't actually achieve their other objectives. You do need to be conscious and conscientious of that. Otherwise, you may design a really novel idea that actually creates more problems than it needs. So just, again, be aware of that as you brainstorm. Okay, we've got our problem. We know the skills. We've designed this surgical intervention that is designed to go alongside and augment things, not take us back to the Stone Age, not throw us blindly into the future. But then what are you going to put in place? And I remember in many organizations that I've been in, I actually either have a point person or a point organization that is outside of it. They're an objective third party that's designed to audit our original measurements for success, so that instead of us, saying we think it's brilliant, well, of course you do. You're involved in it. How are you actually going to do that, so that as you're checking this, you're actually adapting and doing that along the way? Because maybe this typewriter exercise, maybe it'll have an effect for a while, then maybe after a while it won't. Maybe they'll need to adjust. Maybe they'll need to spin things up. Maybe we'll get, far enough in the future where a typewriter won't be, shake people up enough. Maybe you need to go back to stone tablets, or what I'm joking, but you get the point. Is you have to figure out where novelty doesn't just become the only thing. It actually has to be driving a result as measured by somebody who's not in love with the idea itself. So, like I said, I think that's something every single one of us can do in the work or in our lives right now to help us balance this. Because the reality is, the growing rift that we have, it's a huge concern that I have, is that this binary trap, it's destroying leaders, it's destroying organizations, it's just destroying people as a whole, where they feel forced to choose between either just blind pursuit or complete anarchist rebellion against the things. And it puts people in a lose-lose situation. You ban the tech, you're dooming yourself to holding yourself back. You lose the future of where things can go. You completely adopt it, you end up burning yourself up in the stratosphere. And so I think that's just a really important thing. And this is an exercise everybody can do so that we can stop letting the machine dictate everything, while at the same time not creating more problems and more frustration in an effort to try and combat this. I said at the beginning of the year, 2026 was going to be the year of the AI hangover. And I think, with that analogy sticking, we're a little behind schedule, but we have the opportunity now to go, okay, we're waking up a little bit, a little groggy this morning. Like, let's think about what can we learn from this? What can we do in a healthy, balanced way that's going to prepare us for this? And set up 60 minutes this week. Set up 60 minutes where you tell your team, all right, look, we've all been doing this work slop. We've been doing all these things. Like, let's actually talk about this. And maybe that 60 minutes is, where do we brainstorm this concept? Where do we brainstorm a surgical intervention like this? What is the frequency? What is the cadence? What is the actual problem we're trying to solve? And how will we know if we solve it? Pull that together with your team this week and try and find it. Try and execute it and see how it goes. So there you go. Again, I think there's just a lot here that actually does a great job threading the needle, and it's something we all can benefit from, whether you're actually physically going to thrift stores and buying typewriters or finding something that's much more relevant to the world that you're living in. The principles still stand. So if this episode helped you, please, all the things I said before, and check out my website. I love doing this. I love helping people hopefully feel a little bit calmed in crazy times while also staying ahead of the curve. So with that, I'm Christopher Lind. This has been Future Focused, and we will see you on the other side.